All right, so we're going to start our evening banquet panel here on the ethical, moral, and philosophical perspectives. And it's going to be moderated by our own Professor Kristen Stilt, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about all the panelists. Thanks.
Who's pregnant? Had nothing to do with it. Got the tape out of somewhere else. Thanks.
All right, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event, Philosophical, Moral, and Ethical Perspectives. I hope you enjoyed dinner. I want to thank Chris again and Kelly Reddy for working so hard with the caterers on this amazing food. And before introducing our speakers, I just want to recognize someone who I thanked this morning but wasn't here, so now we can actually applaud in his presence. David Wolfson is here amongst us.
Amongst us.
Exactly.
He's amongst us.
He is amongst us. As I mentioned this morning, David is one of our trusted advisors, served to help found the program, and is planning on teaching a farmed animal class here next year. So let me turn to our speakers. So tonight's event is not going to be like today. It's not formal presentations, but rather it's a conversation with three of it's really the deepest thinkers on this topic, and imagine us sitting around a fireplace in armchairs. That's the kind of atmosphere that I was hoping to cultivate. But let me just say a few words about our amazing speakers. Lori Gruen, the William Griffin Professor of Philosophy at Wesleyan University. She's also a professor of feminist, gender, and sexuality studies, and coordinator of the amazing Wesleyan Animal Studies. And all you doctoral students, apply to her program. It's an amazing. I just want to mention a few of the titles of her books, so relevant for tonight. Ethics in Animals, an Introduction, Reflecting on Nature, Readings in Environmental Philosophy and Ethics, The Ethics of Captivity, and Entangled Empathy. So let me also say a few words about Bernard Rollin, who you met earlier today, University Distinguished Professor and Professor of Philosophy, Professor of Biomedical Sciences, Professor of Animal Sciences, and University Bioethicist at Colorado State University. As we talked about today, one of the major architects of the 1985 amendments, and some of his book titles include Natural and Conventional Meaning, Animal Rights and Human Morality, The Unheeded Cry, Animal Consciousness, Animal Pain and Scientific Change, Farm Animal Welfare, The Frankenstein Syndrome, Science and Ethics, among many others. And then let me also introduce Paul Waldell, our third participant, educator, scholar, and activist working at the intersection of animal studies, law, ethics, religion, and cultural studies. He's a professor at Canisius College and the director of the Master of Science graduate program in anthrozoology at Canisius. I also want to point out that we're very grateful to Paul for having taught the animal law course at Harvard Law School for several years before my...
Oh, that's well done. Pretty good.
It's just so hard working with someone who's so amazing. Right?
Should I piss on it?
Might not work.
And Paul is also teaching an animal studies course at the Harvard Summer School. And I just want to mention a couple titles of his books: Animal Studies, an Introduction, Animal Rights, A Communion of Subjects. And I know there's many more that aren't actually listed in your biography that he will tell us about. So tonight's is intended to take a broader view on the Animal Welfare Act and indeed animal welfare. In general, we really dove in very deeply today on so many topics, but tonight we want to take a big picture and ask some bigger questions. Philosophical questions, moral questions, ethical questions, and indeed religious questions, to pick up on Paul's expertise in particular. So let me start by asking you all a very broad question, and you may want to answer this question or wait to the next one. It's up to you. But does the Animal Welfare Act kind of have an ethical, moral philosophical or indeed religious view regarding animals? Can we discern something there that's a coherent view? Do you see something? If you don't like the question, I'll move on.
Can we disagree with each other too?
I hope you do.
Okay.
So you start. No.
Absolutely not.
Okay, we'll disagree with you then.
There is essentially no moral/philosophical thought underlying the Animal Welfare Act. It was essentially created under pressures of expediency. And okay, so far? In 1966, it was the concern of pet owners. And there actually is a USDA history of the Animal Welfare Act, if you're having trouble sleeping. That's worth looking at. The 85 amendments that I talked to you about earlier today were drafted out of the outrage of my colleagues and I regarding the control of pain. But, you know, today there was ample discussion of the inadequacy of the coverage, which animals are in, which animals are out. I mean, it's really surrealistic. The other question that I think the Animal Welfare Act doesn't address is, what's the concept of animal welfare?
Yes. And I wanted to ask you all about that, so if you want to say something about that now.
Whatever you
Go
want,
right ahead.
but I, you know, I'm ready. The concept of animal welfare, contrary to too many scientists, is not a strictly empirical concept. What I always tell my scientist buddies who think it is I give you $1 billion, build a Geiger counter for animal welfare. You see? A machine that will scan an animal and tell you whether it has good welfare or not. And it's impossible. And why is it impossible? Because it's a valuational notion, an quasi-ethical notion. It's the question of what we owe animals and to what extent. Guys okay with that so far? So I have two examples, unless you want to talk for a while, Lori?
Let me just say a
Yeah,
few
why
things.
not, let's let Laura and Paul jump in.
I mean, I agree with that, and I think what's really important, and it came up a little bit today as well, is that there's a really, I think, fundamental difference between questions of animal welfare and questions of animal well-being. And I think it's really important to think about that both ethically and politically. And the sense of it, thinking about it ethically, and Bernie and I could talk more about this, but I think thinking about it ethically, when you think about well-being, you're thinking about something that has to do with the whole of the being, and not just specific instances where they may experience pain. And so I think our panel earlier, where we were thinking in broad terms, not just about the pain that an animal experiences in an experiment, and maybe before and after, as Larry was saying. But even more what Garrett was saying earlier, that there's a whole environment that the animal is in when they're in, let's just say, a laboratory for ease. And there's a deep question about what constitutes the well-being of that individual from birth until the end of their life. And I don't think the Animal Welfare Act addresses that at all. Mm-hmm.
Not at all. Not at all. And, you know, preparing for this, I looked at two roughly contemporaneous accounts of animal welfare. Remember, did you ever study the CAST report?
Okay.
Yeah, the CAST report was something else. The Council of Agricultural Science and Technology in 1980 sort of woke up briefly and said, oh, people are concerned about animal welfare, so we better come up with a definition. And the definition was essentially, if the animal's productive, it's well off. Mm-hmm. That was it. Seriously. Mm-hmm. You know, if it's making milk or babies or meat, then it's well off. Which, I mean, you don't need a lot of smarts to refute that one, right? I particularly like what somebody said not long ago that on a video, you probably saw it, Lori, and you probably saw it too, behind closed doors. Mm-hmm. Yeah, mm-hmm. You remember what the veterinarian says? That the women in the camps were reproductively successful. That's right. And it sure as hell didn't mean that they're well off. Right. Mm-hmm. the people in the worst slums in Rio are highly reproductive. And that's a survival strategy because the state doesn't give a damn if they live or die, you know? So you hope one of your kids make it, right?
Right.
So anyway, that was one that you would find in 1980. And the second one was, which both these guys know well, the Farm Animal Welfare Council, which basically located welfare, at least significantly, in the animals' mental states. And that's the so-called 5 freedoms. Have you heard that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't need to go over it. Mm-hmm. But, for example, the one part that I like is freedom to express normal behavior. If you take that as a guideline for laboratory animal welfare or the welfare of animals in contemporary agriculture, it's cooked. It's really, really bad. And in my own work, in the book I published last week, or I should say the publisher published, I try to give an account of animal welfare based on what I've been trying to do for 40 years. Find an argument that people can't resist. See what I mean? I know that sounds silly, but if you look at Martin Luther King, that's exactly what he did. He didn't use force, sumo. He used judo. He used people's own ethical beliefs against them. And that's what worked. You know, I remember talking to, my wife doesn't like to talk about it. She's half Jewish and half Southern redneck. And tobacco plantation yet. And I remember talking to some of those relatives and said to them, well, think about it. You know, you believe in American principles? Yeah. So you believe all humans are created equally? Yeah. So you believe blacks are created equal to everybody else? Yeah. Okay. You're hoisted on your own petard. See? And that's what I've tried to do with ethics. I think there is an ethic that people all believe in, and a basic decency, which I'm sure both of you guys would agree, in the American public. You know, when they find out about something like the killer whale stuff in California, the elephant shows with Ringling Brothers, they shut them down. They just shut them down. I mean, and that's not to say they don't enjoy the elephant shows and so forth, but they see the animals as significantly important enough to worry about.
Let me see if Paul wants to get on this initial question. I mean,
Let me come back to the
we
animal
have-
welfare.
Okay.
yeah, is there a
philosophy.
coherent view here? Is there a philosophical underpinnings to this, or is
Well,
it just
not underpinning in the sense that the people who passed the 1966 law had a particularly coherent philosophical point of view, but there are philosophical implications, and I think it's a marvelous tool for teaching philosophical points today. When Bernie comes along in 1985, now there is something much more rigorous going on, although you explained today the history behind that, and it strikes me that the Animal Welfare Act has probably got some oomph, partly because of the 1985 changes. That's one of the reasons we pay attention to it. I like to use it as a sort of tool to teach my contemporary students how often it's important to unlearn certain things we think are the fundamental assumptions, like the meaning of welfare in the Animal Welfare Act, and how you have to take charge of your own education. So in a sense, I think there's a philosophical dimension to discussions of the Animal Welfare Act, but not in the inception, not in the founders, except for you. So in that sense, I agree with you. Bernie's one of my mentors. Have you ever heard me disagree with you before? Well, I wasn't in your presence, if so.
Oh, okay. Or I
But
don't
Bernie
remember.
is as lucid on philosophy as it gets. Lori's the same way. I'm sitting between two philosophers saying, yeah, I think there's a philosophical dimension to it, but I'm couching it in careful language.
And
Let's hear more. Yeah, let's hear more
so
about
I just
that.
want to actually, in 1985-86, when the regulations for the new act were being promulgated, there was a lot of controversy going on about what was now in the Act, which was the psychological well-being of non-human primates. Now, so this notion of well-being was being put into the Animal Welfare Act.
And do you accept that language as sort of
Well,
indicating, okay, that's where you're going?
it was a lot of hard work. I remember Roger Fouts in my house in Bethesda at the time, and we were working to try to get the Congress and other people who are working on this to understand what it would mean for non-human primates to have well-being. And I actually thought for 25 years that there was a potential for thinking about well-being in the Animal Welfare Act. And one of the things that happened as a result of the work that we did back then was that single housing of non-human primates was more or less eliminated. At the time, the norm was to singly house non-human primates. The idea then was that at least they will be group housed. Now that, I mean, those of you who've worked with non-human primates are well aware that that's not a, sort of anything like, we shouldn't be self-congratulatory about that. But I actually believe for 25 years that that would not actually achieve well-being, but be conducive to well-being. So here's the philosophy. In 2012, I was invited to the University of Wisconsin to talk to the Forum on Animal Research Ethics. And for those of you who've known me for that many years, you will find this surprising. I was invited to tour the Wisconsin Primate Regional Facility. I was invited. There was nothing illegal about what I did at the time. I was invited. When I was there, I can tell you, I mean, this was in 2012, so it was right before Ned Kalin was getting his maternal deprivation research at Wisconsin restarted. I had long conversations with the veterinarians on the Iacuk. There's a whole story there. But what I wanted to mention was that I went through and saw room after room after room filled with 4x4, so 4 primates per cage in 4x4, so two and two and two and two configurations, and a whole room, and I thought I was in cuckoo's nest. So this group housing, these animals were as distressed as I have ever seen any animal. And this group housing, which was supposed to be at least part of the way towards the promotion of well-being, was actually the opposite. Now, what's really been challenging philosophically is that the nursery, where there were infants that were not with their mothers, was actually, they were with each other. They were not with their mothers. But those infants were in a much more well-being conducive environment than those mass rooms with crazy animals that couldn't escape each other and were there screaming pretty much all the time. And so that really raised questions for me about when we're thinking about well-being, when we're thinking about how to create regulations to promote well-being, this is all within a larger institutional structure that's not interested really in ethics. And so I think so my idea about welfare is not necessarily what we're looking for, well-being is what we're looking for, and to get into the element of an ethical framework for the law, I think there needs to be something much more holistic, or something much more where the idea is not to regulate a commitment to the ethical treatment of animals or the ethical concern for their well-being, but something that really is organic or stems from something. So the Animal Welfare Act is about checking off boxes. It's still about checking off boxes. And you can't really promote ethical well-being when you're checking off boxes.
So that was the next question. Maybe you want to say something about that, Paul, is then what is the Animal Welfare Act about? It's clearly not the Animal Well-Being Act. So is that even the wrong word? Or do we say it's welfare, but it's a very minimalist conception that has nothing to do with well-being?
When I submitted a proposal for this, Chris, you and I had some nice talks about this. The topic was from success to failure and fig leaf. The Animal Welfare Act initial success, particularly I think in 1985. These are the critical amendments. But as you heard from so many stories today, the Animal Welfare Act is a disaster if it's your lead and fundamental protection. It is, of course, better than nothing. That's not much of a compliment, though, given the present regime. I think it's a villain in this sense. we are all now familiar with the sense of, I don't like animal rights, I'm for animal welfare, meaning I favor industry making very minor ameliorations of harsh, terrible conditions, and because they make minor ameliorations of those conditions, they can say, we're for animal welfare. Now, none of us would ever, if we came to the end product, the improved result, look at the condition of the animals and say, this is good welfare. Good welfare is a robust concept that, at its best, is a synonym for what we often call animal rights. But there is a tepid, almost insipid sense of animal welfare that I think the AWA has implanted in us so that people will say, I favor animal welfare, sounding elegant, when what they really are saying, I favor domination with slight improvements over hellish conditions. And in other words, they're for human privilege completely in domination. And that way, the AWA in its current form, I think, is a fig leaf for domination. Now, it's a beautiful concept. And I don't think there's any way to take, Bernie, what you taught me about the 1985 amendments had great potential, but we're in a political situation where the potential has become hell. Fair?
Fair enough.
So we talked today quite a bit about the fact that it only covers animals in certain specific contexts. What do those contexts tell us about the way we view animals, our relationship to animals as a society? Do they tell us anything at all about who we choose to protect and in which particular contexts?
To me, it just tells you what particular thing tickled the public mind at a certain period. You know, if they're worried about kidnapping, it goes there. If you know, we manage to spread the word that the animals are in pain a great deal of time, they go to pain. But I think, this is probably the first time you ever hear me say anything hopeful.
No, it's not.
Oh, no? Okay. But I think the American public has really tuned in to concern for animals. You see that in Pacelli's new book. Did you see his new book? Yeah.
No, it's the economy, the humane economy.
Yes.
The humane economy, yeah. Where he basically says, people get concerned and they express those concerns, and the companies change. And it's a lot better than interposing a bureaucratic structure.
So the Animal Welfare Act will become less and less relevant as
I
more
suspect.
consumer-driven demands improve
Yeah.
conditions.
Yeah, that's what I think.
What do you think about
So
that?
I'm gonna just raise some issues against the grain a little bit, or maybe undercurrents that you were, I think, maybe starting to get at. And I think this is really important to thinking about how much attention and energy to put into thinking about these sort of marginal improvements in welfare concerns, even though, as everybody said, we don't want to not do that. So there's a tension, right? There's a tension about the domination that you were talking about, the instrumentalization. And what I like to think about is what kind of relationship do we want to be in with other animals? What kind of relationships are we already in? And are they objects, tools, instruments, things to consume, things that the economy can help us figure out what to do with? What does that mean ethically when other animals that are in our lives are dominated? I like that term. That we're exerting our magnanimous indulgence of their welfare or well-being, and that their lives as their own lives, animals as beings who make their own meaning, is completely invisible because we're stymied by this legal system and legislative system that makes it so that we can't see them as beings that might be no longer objects but also subjects in their own right. And I think that's one of the things that is really difficult, because on the one hand, we want to be able to think ethically about these relationships, to make them better, to figure out more important ways of respecting other animals, engaging our empathetic attention towards them, developing our compassion as humans. So we could just be self-interested. I want to be a more compassionate person. And then the system, the legal system that has it be either that we just want to consume them in ways that don't make us feel too bad, or instruments that produce our knowledge. And I think these frameworks are very, very difficult to put together. Now, having said that, I don't want to say that we shouldn't be acknowledging the Animal Welfare Act for at least providing some way of getting more support for a recognition of what other animals are suffering in our use of them. But I do think it really does constrain us. And it puts us in tension with a higher ethical ideal.
To say it's dependent upon our consumer culture. What consumers want is what they get.
Right.
I asked Bernie if I could go ahead of him because I always defer to Bernie. An observation. I think the Animal Welfare Act, if you asked me today, would you like to get rid of it? I'd say, no, absolutely not. Not in the present situation. Absolutely not. I'll keep it for a while, but could we please improve it in the following way? I think it has forced us into a habit that we already had that is destructive in the extreme. I want my graduate students to see this. I push them relentlessly. Chris, you and I have had wonderful conversations just when we were in the room we did this. I want people to see that humans are animals. I'm sitting here with animals, an animal on my right, two animals on my left, quite a few out in front of me. I'm completely aware of this. Everybody knows this is the absolute, certainly, clearly the truth. The Animal Welfare Act tricks us into, this is a philosophical point under Wittgenstein's theory that philosophy is the battle against the bewitchment of our minds by means of language. Humans and animals. Throughout the conference today, the vast majority of people use the conceptuality, humans and animals. They're the animals, we're the humans. It's like, wow. That's not just unscientific, it's anti-scientific. It's also anti-communal. Think about this. This group today was a wonderful exercise in a group of animals talking about our capacious ethical abilities as expanding beyond our own particular species to others. Not every species. And the Animal Welfare Act tricks us into thinking that somehow we are ethically capacious if we will just ameliorate cages and take them from 5 by 5 by 7 to 10 by 10 by 10. That's somehow an ethical act. Seriously? Not even close. The ethical acts are treating others as your potential equal, unlearning the nonsense that you learn to talk about humans and animals, to teach your children to talk humans and animals, for the science professors in my department to teach their students to talk humans and animals, when everybody knows we're primates, we're mammals. These are animal categories. I'm sitting here with blood proteins that are identical to how many other primates? I'm 100% animal, and what we do when we care about other animals is a straight-out animal achievement. An animal achievement. And all the elegant, Ron, think of what you do. It's an animal achievement for you to see the zoo animals that you protect. It's an elegant ability that many animals care about others. Which others? Okay, that's a complex ethical question. The Animal Welfare Act has tricked us, dumbed us down. It's an exemplification of what Helvetia said. Humans aren't born stupid. They're born ignorant. They're made stupid by education. And our education system, our legal systems, our mainline religious traditions have dumbed us down to think there's this natural division, humans and animals. Come on. We're responsible. That's why I mentioned my graduate students. I want them, you take charge of your education, and you choose the way you speak. You don't have to deal with me cuffing you if you don't say non-human animals. But if I had one plea to the group, I'd say, go into your communities and teach them to not be slovenly with language. Teach them, call it out. I'm an animal. It's a cool thing. And when animals are humble and sharing and capacious and caring about ethical abilities like you have taught me to do, you too. It's a totally cool thing. It's a very animal, strong reality. I struggle because the establishment today, even at marvelous Harvard Law School, still use the unrealistic human privileging dualism, humans and animals. Could we please stop? Be courageous. Go into your institutions and say, I'm an animal. It's okay. Because we are, and we're going to be, and all the humans henceforth are going to be as well. Could we please come home to our natural community? Please.
Then you'll get a phone call from HR on her.
Oh, I'm probably going to be on that. I'm going to be on Professor's list. Yes, you're right. And the FBI.
All right, so Paul.
I don't have a problem with anything Paul said. I mean, but it's somewhat idealistic. It's not a space that I've pretty much, I mean, I've worked on a theoretical level for a long time, but I've always tried to put it into practice. I had a mentor who said to me very early on, did you know Dave Neal? Okay. He was really a very, very smart guy, and he said, look, take stock every 6 months of what you've done, and if the animals are no better off, you're basically just masturbating.
Can I stop you for a second? Do you know this is the advice you gave me when I had just become the director of the Center for Animals? We were sitting out in front of the administration building. That's exactly what it said to me, and it's become the #1 guide in my life and how I conduct my work.
Bless you, my son.
I'm so glad we facilitated a reunion. I wasn't even aware of that. But Paul, you mentioned amongst many other lovely things you said, the issue of cages. And if we think about it, so much of our conversation today was about cages, right? Mother dogs in breeding cages, primates in research cages, Lolita, roadside zoos, and Laura, you in particular have written about captivity. What does that mean that so much of our conversation is about captivity and confinement and containment?
I think that's a really important part of this question, and it's not, again, if we're going to think about these questions in an ethical and a broader ethical way, what we want to do is not think about just captivity in animals, but captivity in humans. And I think somebody said this, maybe Garrett said this earlier. Some of the work that I do is in a maximum security prison, and it's important for me to think about the ways in which human animals, non-human animals, are kept in cages, and the underlying ethical notion that this captivity allows. And there's a lot of different things we could say about it ethically and politically, but I think that part of what's really at stake here is who is it that imagines that there is this other group, whatever that other group might be, who is less deserving and more capable of being contained in these ways, and the deceit, the myth, the idea that somehow what we need to be focused on is better cages, is at least in the human prison context, we think about that as, sort of a sense of reform, as a way, instead of a way of really rethinking the ways in which our society thinks about each other. And in that case, I also mean other animals, not just ourselves. And so I think that again, this trickery, this deception that's going on in the Animal Welfare Act that makes us think, all right, let's make these captive conditions better, brings us back to the idea that these captive conditions are never possibly better. As we saw, I think the idea that movement, elephants, we heard and we know, move vast distances. Whales swim vast distances. Captivity for them is actually meaning destroying. It destroys meaning for them. And that's a harm that we don't talk about. When we're thinking about sizes, 5 by 5 by 7 to 12 by 12 by 10, whatever, what we're forgetting is that this is life destroying. This is meaning destroying from the get-go when you put somebody into captivity. And that isn't even something that's discussed in the Animal Welfare Act. Bigger cages doesn't talk about the way in which we're fundamentally distorting what it is to be that being and make the world the way that that being is. And I think, unfortunately, we are in a situation where there are going to be captives, human and non-human, I'm imagining. And so the really interesting ethical questions in terms of well-being that I think need to be worked on much more is what would it mean to provide a life that is full of well-being for individuals whose life choices have to be contained. And we've begun to do that a little bit, I think, in the sanctuary world. I think some zoos are starting to think a little bit more about this. But the Animal Welfare Act doesn't even begin to provide us with any of the mechanisms for thinking about those kinds of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Which it was never intended to do. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. At least let's give them a little credit in that area. Mm-hmm. But we've been occasioned to think about it by its very presence, and that's salubrious.
So what does a robust notion of welfare look like?
Well, the idea, I think the idea was that there is such a thing as well-being for psychological well-being. So that was part of the ways in which the act was moving. So it was trying to do that, but it never got beyond, or dogs being able to walk, or primates living together, but it never really got into a notion of what would really constitute the welfare of another. And these are where I think ethical and philosophical issues are so
Remember the
important.
story I told Lori about the guy at USDA
Yeah.
going to talk to the primate division of the American Psychological Association
Yeah.
and them saying, psychological well-being, there's no such thing. And that was dogma for years and years and years in the psychological community, the ethological community, even Conrad Lorenz, And so that needs restructuring. And actually, a lot of that restructuring is coming from the public that just flat won't buy that crap.
Part of that's premise, though. What year do you publish The Unheeded Cry? 1980?
9.
Okay. This is a really seminal book. It just points out how scientists are governed by an ideology which, for whatever their level of critical thinking is, they don't seem to be able to identify fish in water sort of problem. You call them out on it. So Bernie basically outs the whole scientific community, much like Donald Griffin does in the way at Harvard. I mean, this is a really important kind of book. And although it's not, it's in a way, other books you write later will push, but that book was wonderful history showing how science flirted with great connection to the emotional abilities in other animals in the late 19th century with Thorndike and those kind of people. And you point out, but then they get shut down. And it gets into a political correctness of don't you dare, don't you dare.
Oh, yeah.
And science becomes a petty affair through that. And you challenged them, come back to your basic genius here, kind of just question everything, the real mantra of the Science Channel, question everything. That was a marvelous book that way, Bernie.
Thank you.
Can you tell that I like his work?
Well, it's the certainly of all the books I've done, it's the one I'm most happy with.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And
Not Science and Ethics?
no,
Because that's the one I use.
but that's fine. Meanwhile, I've had one book in print for just to give you guys an idea. Since 1980, The Animal Rights and Human Morality,
Yeah.
which was the first book after Peter Singer, as I recall. And I have figured out, it's been constantly in print, I'm just netted about $7 an hour. And partially it's because, I probably shouldn't say this, I'm being recorded, right? I've had editors tell me that they flat lie about how many they've sold.
Oh.
And in fact, in one case, a colleague of mine sued them, and they settled out of court so that the other authors wouldn't start. You see?
So we only have a few minutes left.
Say what?
We only have a few minutes left. So I want
Okay.
to return us to a bigger question of what does a robust notion of welfare look like, and can law provide it?
A robots?
Robots. A different form of
I knew
non-human.
it.
A
Implying that I'm
meaningful
bullshitting.
definition of welfare, a robust definition. What would it look like, and can law provide it?
Are you assuming a conscious robot?
No, robust. Robust. What is a robust
Okay, because I just had this question from a student.
Meaningful.
I'll tell you very quickly what I think a robust notion of welfare is. Animals, Aristotle had it right. Animals have natures. And respecting those natures, not giving analgesia and not giving psychedelic drugs, but making sure the animal lives the kind of life it's patterned to live. There's a wonderful piece of research that's been done that shows that repeatedly, if you put coyotes into a trap, they'll chew their legs off to get out. What are the implications of that? Chewing your leg off must be horrendously painful. But freedom means more to them. They're willing to undergo that pain. Chickens, you probably saw that research, will cross an electrified grid to get to the outdoors. This isn't rocket science. You know, any farmer who has worked extensively with animals will tell you what the animals' natures are. And if we ever want to really build a good Animal Welfare Act, we will constrain human use of animal activities by respect for their natures. That make sense to you guys?
Does it allow any of the uses?
Thanks.
Does that then eliminate essentially all of the uses currently permissible? Or are you trying to say you can do both?
Well, I mean, look, we raised animals by respecting their natures in 11,000 years of agriculture. This abomination, this confinement agriculture, is at most 100 years old, and basically driven by technology.
But the
Right.
uses under the Animal Welfare Act, are they consistent with the definition of welfare you just provided? Is it possible to do what you've said and to continue exhibition, breeding, research?
No, probably not.
An observation?
Yeah.
I think one of the great complications is, although we're quite educated, all of us, it's lovely, that Kant defined the Enlightenment as coming out of self-inflicted ignorance. And in many ways, we're in that position right now. We have to unlearn some of the real narrow stuff. Ron, I wrote an article once about zoos imprison us, because they create a mentality of going there on exhibition, and what child leaves the zoo not aware that I'm leaving the zoo, the other animal's still
Right,
there when I
right.
want to come back, and who is the superior animal, whose interests? I do think in ways zoos are going to be here a long time, and they ought to have, could we clone you? This is really important, but there are some institutions that we inherited that have dumbed us down, and now what does it mean for us to learn? What does it mean to have real welfare? Part of it is going and being in the world in a respectful way, to patiently observe, to try to unlearn some of the real negative things we've learned, and to read and to pass them along to Lark, to Maurice. I mean, these are really important principles. It also is a very humble thing for us to notice this. And I don't think we have all the answers, but I do think we begin to approach the answers through humility. I actually think humans are the most special animals on the earth in one condition, when we're humble. And how often is that? This group has a lot of humility in it. It's a lovely thing to see. But out in the regular world, no. And it is a disappointing thing to be an animal activist and to realize I'm going to die. They're probably going to be worse when I die than when I was born. Okay. But what is it that we can do? Light a match rather than curse the darkness. Okay? It just seems to me that's the great benefit to what's happened here. From the time I started teaching in 2002 to now, it's exploded. It's like, okay, I'm gonna give myself hope again. That's a lovely opportunity. Is it realistic? I don't know. You guys will hopefully tell me in a couple of years. But the point is, there is something really good happening. You could see that in the dynamism throughout this, but the dynamism must have infused a deep sense of humility about, God, have we screwed it up? Okay, so what do we do now? Now we start to light a match instead of cursing the darkness.
Well said.
Lori,
And
the
I
last few
just-
thoughts to you.
I just wanted to sort of kind of reframe a tiny bit, which is to think much more about the relationships that we're in, and to actually imagine how it is that the animals are looking back at us, and what they might be thinking about what we should be doing about their welfare. And I think once we do, this is an extension of humility. It's what I call entangled empathy, and it's this idea that what we really need to recognize when we're trying to think about the welfare of others is that they're there too. We're not making these decisions unilaterally. They're there too, and we can imagine how we reflect back in their eyes. And I think that when we think about it that way, we're not really going to be able to imagine, oh, I see, we're going to put you in a cage that's a little bit larger. Oh, we're going to take you from your family to have you breed with somebody else. Or we're going to humanely kill you so that we can eat you. I don't know that the animals would look at us and endorse that relationship if it were possible for them to do that. And so that imaginative act, I think, is a really important way of trying to get at what it would mean to really promote others' welfare.
The great common sense philosopher Thomas Reid once said, if you want to be a good philosopher, be as a child again. And I remember my son, who, he's now a psychiatrist. He deals with eating disorders, which is the #1 cause of death in psychiatry. So in his own way, he's a tough guy. And we were driving up to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and we stopped at a railroad crossing next to a cattle truck. He started to cry. This is a kid who 6 months earlier had broken his arm and didn't cry. In fact, the doctor said it's not broken because the kid would be crying. I just think probably the only time I ever saw him cry. And I said, shit, what's the matter? He said, look at those animals. They're on 2 decks of the truck, and they're shitting on each other. He said, that's just wrong. You know? And you find this with children. You also find great cruelty with children. But I think the good dominates. I want to believe that the good dominates. Those of you who have kids, am I wrong? Tough audience.
That's a beautiful thought to end with, and I'm sorry that we do have to end at 8 o'clock, or else we could continue for quite a much longer time. But thank you so much for this discussion. Really, thank you.
You gotta